the video was very quick. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. So today we have an exciting webinar. It's with Peter Fishman from Mozart Data. Peter Fishman, aka Fish, or actually really kind of only known as Fish, is joining us for a conversation about data and startups, and kind of a pretty wide-ranging conversation. By quick introduction, I am Ben Stansel. I'm one of the founders of Mode. And as I said, joined by Fish, and I'll hand it over to Fish to quickly introduce himself before we get started. So Fish, welcome.
Ben, you hit the high points. I'm Fish. I'm the co-founder of Mozart Data and former colleague of Ben's.
Awesome. Former colleague Fish was my first boss in the data world when I made the jump from working in DC to working in tech. Fish was the person who hired me. So all of you have Fish to blame for me being a part of your Wednesday afternoon 10 years later. Okay, so for this conversation, the kind of framing is essentially, how to scale data at startups and things like that. But I want to get started in a slightly different place. So as Fish mentioned, we worked together 10 years ago. We worked together at a company called Yammer, kind of an early consumerization of IT SaaS business. Was very focused on building out a data team and thinking about things in the ways that consumer companies thought about data. And so in that time, we basically built out a bunch of tools internally that looked very similar to what the modern data stack is today, but were a very early form of it. They were kind of like a proto version of the modern data stack that were either internal tools or sort of early cloud-based tools. Obviously, over the last 10 years, we've had a ton of progress on that front. There's been a whole bunch of new tools and companies that have gotten started to help folks like ourselves do our jobs better and more effectively and things like that. But despite all of that progress, it doesn't necessarily feel like data teams have made the same level of progress. That we've had these huge leaps forward in technology, but in terms of like the impact that data teams have and things like that, doesn't quite feel like we've had a commiserate leap forward. So Fish, do you agree with that? And if you do, like why haven't we been more successful as teams if we've been so successful as technologists?
So, I mean, a great lead in, obviously, part of it might be a rosy look at the past. So, we had some pretty not so special early versions of, tools that are today so incredibly special and, made them effective, but made them effective largely through people, energy, and effort. So, all of these advances have largely, stolen the most rote, most annoying parts of our jobs when we were sort of doing the same type of work, analytics, at the type of startup that was the subject of today. So there's this idea of scaling, data at startups, and we've instantly pivoted to. Have we made any progress as an industry scaling data at startups, rather than sort of the tips for scaling data at startups? That said, I'm happy to riff on this subject. I would say we, this is, in part stolen from your blog, but also, a core belief that I have is that I would say that we haven't made nearly as much progress as the tooling. So there is this idea that as the tooling increases, our efficacy, our effectiveness ends up increasing, and our sort of impact on the company ends up increasing. I would say that certainly hasn't come to fruition over the last 10 years, despite it being very unambiguously clear that the tooling, including Mode, is just so much better than what we used to use.
So why is that? Like, why and well, I have a follow-up question to that, but why do you think that is? Why do we have such better tools that in theory would make us more effective at what we do, but in practice maybe not so much?
So like when I answer any analytics, so it's been a little while since I've been a data analyst, but like let's say we have a hypothesis that that basically the effectiveness of data teams is largely unchanged or slightly positive over the last decade, while the effectiveness of their tools has many x'd.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a number of reasons why it could be. So one of the things is it could just be harder to do our jobs. There's a higher bar for our jobs. That one of the things that we used to do, or one of Ben's like earliest jobs, would be to like count active users. Today, you don't need a Ben Stancil to do that. There are many tools where sort of just a basic count of users or a basic count of active users is just sort of already pre-baked in. Our bar keeps getting higher. So in some sense, we might be measuring ourselves against, I think a lot of this conversation might end up having a little bit of baseball or sports analytics, but like against like value over replacement. So a lot of the things that were incredible value adds for our team a decade ago are pretty commonplace for anyone at the company, and certainly operators at the company to be able to understand. So it could be that our jobs are getting harder. It could be that we're just making. You could imagine that there's actually like a concave curve of impact. So if you measure impact on the vertical axis and like progress or effort, you could imagine that we'd be in a really flat part of a concave curve in terms of where sort of data analytics effort is. I think it's probably I posed those two, but it's probably neither of those. I think it might just be that we're focused on things that are very impactful at some companies, or disproportionately impactful at some companies, but maybe less so at others. So, a lot of the tooling that we've built have really helped teams get from, an A- to an A+, as opposed to helping teams get from, a D or an F, up to a much more palatable grade. So I think like when we talk about, okay, has the industry made these steps forward? It's probably, it's probably, there's not like a uniform customer that you can answer that for.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay, so I have a couple thoughts on that and a follow up. I don't know if I've told you this before yet. A rough theory of like data at companies. That's like the sort of microwave appliance theory of this, which is microwaves are really valuable. People use them all the time. They're kind of a ubiquitous thing. They don't need to be innovated on. Like they do one thing fine. There doesn't really make any sense to say like, how do we continue to push forward with like microwave technology? Like we got sort of, as you said, the early part of that value curve is really high or steep or whatever, and then it flattens out pretty quickly after that, and everything else is sort of like pushing on an asymptote. It feels to me like potentially there's an argument that a lot of what startups and companies are trying to do with data is similar, where there's a really valuable initial thing of like counting users and sort of doing some basic stuff to understand the reporting of your business, like sort of operational grease. But the rest of it, we haven't yet quite figured out how to make valuable outside of certain exceptions. There's some companies that do a really good job of this. There's some companies that have sort of naturally valuable problems. But for a lot of companies, data is a microwave. And like you need to do the basic stuff. You need to go from the D to the B, but like the investment to go from a B to an A or something really great may not necessarily be there yet. Like we may need a sort of next sort of big advancement in technology to have like the reason why people want to be able to do that. The current stuff is sort of fiddling with a microwave where it like doesn't actually need that much improvement.
Well, I'm gonna go with a super disagree.
Okay, great.
I think that the given problems that are top of mind for you initially are so much like a microwave that you're like, okay, I need to count my users, or I need to know, who's going to churn, or I need to, sum my revenue, or I need to forecast my revenue, or whatever it is. Those all are on the asymptotes that you're discussing. So those are, not fully solved, but some variant of close to solved. And when we think about kind of, you have this sort of model of, okay, well, the microwave either like heats the thing, and yes, you can have fancier buttons, etc. And maybe instead of it taking a minute to microwave my coffee, it takes 50 seconds or some sort of additional benefit. I would say that as you get a more powerful microwave, you discover cooler and cooler things that you do. So if you were to list all the things that a fancier microwave would do for you, you would find yourself actually not having that much value over a 1960s microwave. But if you were to sort of start using a fancy microwave and realize the types of questions that come from it, I think you very quickly hit pockets, where you'll discover more things, that an innovative person will discover more things. I think very often when you lay out your plan for the types of analytics you'll do, you sort of miss what's possible as you get into the sort of virtuous cycle of, we learn stuff, we learn what's sort of wrong or inconsistent about it, we learn what's insightful about it, we push on what's insightful, and then we have to go find a new hill to climb.
Mhm.
And I do think that I think this idea of the microwave is, again, another wrong version of why we haven't made as much advancement despite all of the incredible advances in the tools.
Gotcha. Okay, so there's sort of my fundamental theory of technological innovation, which is not based on anything, is essentially that big advances are things like essentially teleportation. It takes you from a place that you can't see to a place you can see, and you don't really know what's on the other side of that until you get there. You can't predict if you snap your fingers and teleport somewhere, you can't anticipate anything that's going to happen on the other side of that because you have no idea where you're going to be. And so it's kind of actually getting all these sort of more powerful tools doesn't necessarily make the things you are trying to do today better, but once you have them, there's a bunch of new capabilities there that sort of open up possibilities that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise.
When we worked together at Microsoft, one of the favorite topics was data cubes, and I hated data. I know it's still one of your favorite topics. I hated data cubes, and the reason that I hated data cubes was that I always felt like there was some cut of the analysis that was always unanticipated but necessary. And again, if you take the smartest people and you put them in a room and you force them to say, okay, what are all the cuts of data that you could ever possibly want? And you squared those cuts, and you still would not find that what needed to be anticipated could be anticipated. So I think this idea of the limitation of data at startups is a function of the tool only needs to be so good. I think I would obviously disagree with that.
So to change directions in a little bit, say you are someone who is joining one of these companies, or you are an early data hire, first data hire at a startup, starting to think about how do you make data effective at that startup? What do you do? What actually, if you were to leave Mozart and go somewhere else to a 10-person company as the first data hire, what are the steps that you take to be the effective data team and not the one that's marginally more effective than we were 10 years ago? How do you take advantage basically of all the new things that we have now that we didn't have in 2012?
Yeah, so I have left companies to go be the first data hire at places. And I actually am the first data hire at Mozart as well. So I also do a lot of our internal analytics. So, the first thing, if you're trying to make a data team more effective, you sort of have to think about the actual question you're trying to answer. So are you trying to make the company more effective? Are you trying to check a box in terms of serving the data needs that are asked by the CEO or by the executives or the board or whomever? Are you trying to advance your career? Are you trying to, sort of elevate yourself into, be in the room where it happened or whatever it is? I think one of the challenges of saying, how do you make data effective at startups? Like, well, what's the actual goal that you're trying to achieve with that? The short version is I actually think a lot of these things actually all collide. The Venn diagram of these sort of goals and ambitions, I think, has a pretty large center where these things actually intersect quite a bit. The first thing to understand is, yes, there's a standard playbook for putting in the basics. There's a variety of tools. Obviously, you and I both work at tools companies where we sell things that we think help teams accelerate into having the sort of infrastructure to get analytics right. But I think that there's like something, more basic to it, which is, if you think a little bit about what analytics is, it's the optimizing of, whether it's like an operation or a business practice or a decision. So it's really positioning yourself to optimize as many of these things as possible. And usually there's the way to do that, is obviously be an expert about the business, be an expert about the data, be reliable in the data, raise your trust and your profile. Now, some of that is sort of given. You might start with a bunch of that currency, and some of that is very, very, very earned the very, very hard way.
What's the hard way?
I think
if you got to earn it, basically. Like you've worked it. So for a bit of background, Fish is, you've, like, over the last 10 years been either a data leader or the first data hire at what, 5 or 6 startups, 5 startups, I don't know, a bunch.
7, but okay.
Okay.
Sure.
So Fish has some.
Yeah, it doesn't speak to long tenures at places, but I will say that they were all many special tenures at places and solved a lot of different problems. Actually, solved a lot of the same problem in very in various contexts.
So how do you earn that currency? So by the way, I mentioned this was a logistical note I should have mentioned at the beginning of this. If folks have questions, please ask them in the chat. We'll kind of try to get to them in the course of the conversation. But one of those questions was basically, how do you create a business case to invest in data tools? Which to me could also kind of read the same as, like, you have to earn the currency that you're describing. Like, people will want to spend money on tooling if you can convince your executives that what you are doing as a team is valuable and that tooling is a helpful part of that process. But it really kind of raises the question again of, how do you earn the currency you're describing? Like, if you come in and you don't have the trust already, there are some founders and stuff that are going to be like, yes, we need to go invest in a bunch of data stuff because they kind of come from that background. But if they're not that, and there isn't a team that already exists that has done this job, like, what is it that you did to make people actually believe the things that you're saying and want more of it?
So that's a hard place to start, right? So when you're in a place where, you're already making really impassioned cases for tooling that's going to accelerate the company, it's a hard place to start. One of the things that I'm known for is a reluctancy to spend freely. So I think having a lot of discipline around spending, whether it's on any sort of dimension at a company, I think sort of having a lot of sort of trust that you're taking a lot of responsibility here. I think earning sort of a seat at the table starts with having a different perspective. If we were trying to measure, say, the weight of an animal, and like 10 people had like a view that saw, perfectly, maybe horizontally how long the animal was, and then one person had the view of the width, that would be a very valuable perspective to have. So I think, one, really coming from a place of, you can generate a unique, correct and reliable answer, I think is really important. The second thing that I think is a reality is that everybody has questions, and if you're willing to do sort of, I would call it like grunt-ish work, you can sort of, get some reciprocity for that. So very often there will be, Ben and I worked at Yammer, and one of my, favorite, an internal communications tool, and one of my favorite messages was @Ben Stansel. @Ben Stansel was a code for go solve this problem, and it was usually some honestly trivial problem. Count the number of users in Germany. Count the number of users in Germany that haven't sent 4 messages. These are questions that are not particularly valuable to the company, but it was a way of sort of earning reciprocity currency, and was a way of sort of bolstering our status within the organization as a team that's both willing to make an investment, but also when we would say no to things, there would be a long list of things that we had said yes to. That was basically proof that we sort of juggled doing what was valuable for the company from our perspective and doing what was valuable for the company from other leaders' perspective. We juggled that pretty successfully.
Yeah, I mean, I in kind of thinking it back, so I had the benefit of joining Yammer after the team was pretty well established, or established at least in the sense that it had that currency, and a lot of it was, sort of credit to Fish, was like it is a team that had played the politics right in the beginning, that didn't have like, there is sort of a trope around data teams about like you have to say no, you have to like ask people why they want things and things like that, and there's very much like a bedside manner to that it seemed like the team when I joined had done that right, where it wasn't a bunch of like, no, that's not worth our time, we're not going to do it, let me tell you why you're an idiot, which is somewhat of a common thing among data teams. It was much more of a, like, we obviously want to help, we're going to do all the things we can to help. Like it felt very much like a team that was a part of the broader team, not one that was trying to be sort of the outside consultancy to prove that they were smarter than everybody else, which is still a little bit of a habit I think that some teams can fall into, especially when you are have so many things you're trying to juggle, and like that's sort of the easy reaction to be like, look, I have a bunch of stuff to do, I don't have time for this, I don't have time for that, and show me why this is valuable before I even touch it. Well, go ahead.
No, that's, I mean, I think that's really the key insight. We have this webinar on scaling data at startups, and we both work at, again, tools companies that massively help teams scale data at startups. And then, you and I both gave an answer that had the flavor of, you play the politics right, you sit in the right seat, you answer the right questions, you do so with great bedside manner. Both of us have spent the last, call it 10 years of our lives trying to build the tools that like deeply enable teams that can do that list of things that you just mentioned and make them much more effective. But in order to be effective, essentially, again, it gets this virtuous cycle argument. In order to even have those tools be impactful, you need to start from a place of, boy, when there's a certain type of question, and that could be very narrowly defined. When I started my career, before I worked, with you at Yammer, I was working in video games, and I had a real knack for guessing the sort of like the expected value or the lifetime value of populations and of players. So I worked at a video games company, and I was really good at figuring out, okay, if we run Facebook ads and get 1,000 players in Oklahoma to sign up, and the subset is females between the ages of 28 and 47, if we get 10,000 of them, how much expected revenue do we expect to see in 6 months? And it was like a party trick. I could like pull it out. I could do the calculation. I could look at past cohorts. I could and now these are all pretty easy tasks. But 15 years ago this was kind of special. It used to be like magical. But just offering that to the marketing team put me in a really great spot, and that was and one that they wanted me in on that because I had no marketing skills. There was nothing threatening. I just had this like cool little party trick that I could pull out, and I think like that's a great starting place. Like find a very narrow part of the business where you can very clearly add to an impact based on your data skills.
Yeah, and there was one thing I actually remember you telling me this sometime way back, that like the most useful insight that you gave like the CEO at Yammer was that people use the product less on weekends than they did on weekdays. So Yammer was like Slack essentially. You can imagine basically usage patterns the same as Slack. And obviously, like, people are going to chat less about work stuff on weekdays than or weekends than weekdays. But there was something about like quantifying this obvious intuition that it was 60% less, but could it have been 90%? Could it have been like 10%? Like, I don't know. And nobody really, it didn't necessarily drive a decision, but there was something about this, like, oh, this kind of obvious intuition that we all have, we can now see in very clear ways. And it wasn't trying to find, oh, we have to go find something that's like the most impactful thing. It wasn't going out to try to find like this big eureka moment that would immediately change the business. It was just giving people these sorts of nuggets that were like, these things may be obviously true, but they help me establish some reality that I already kind of assumed, in a way that I can now come back to this guy and I trust him because, like, he's telling me a bunch of things that make sense.
Yeah, I don't want to. So I can't remember sometimes there's like these like mentalist shows where like they go and they pick up on obvious tells of yours and they tell you, oh, you've had someone very impactful in your life and that person was a male. And then you say, oh, my father. And it's like, oh my God, how did you know? And, I think that there's some variant of that, which is, when you're a data person, the most easy and obvious insights are confirming sometimes, and also present, like you said, something interesting. The magnitude there is interesting, and actually, just to be very clear, it also isn't totally non-actionable. So a lot of times, we had an international tool, and a lot of times on US holidays, the traffic would go down for obvious reasons, similar to a weekend. Because we had a business tool, and nobody uses that business tool on the 4th of July, or nobody uses it on Labor Day, and this is not surprising. But then the question is, how much should our overall traffic be down? Do we need to take an action on one of these vacations? Do we need to call in people on vacation? And actually, that insight of the magnitude of how much people worked less on the weekends was actually later applicable. It's one of those things where I'm like, I'm going to do something that's very obvious, that's very easy for me to count things, grouped by the day. And then that actually became helpful to the company a little bit later.
So, okay, we have another question, and I want to sort of roll this into a second thing. So somebody asks, what are common metrics to measure if the output of a data team has reached a plateau? Which I kind of also want to generalize a little bit about, like, measuring the data team. We talked at the beginning about, like, some teams can be very effective. Sometimes even with the new technology, all these new technologies, teams can get sort of stuck. Like, how do you know where your team is on that scale? Like, when you were running a team, how do you judge whether or not the team is growing, improving, doing things they need to, if they're plateauing, if they're not at the level they want? There's sort of a growth versus proficiency question a little bit in here of, like, is it the absolute level that you care about? Is it the fact they're growing, but things like that. But basically, like, how do you measure a team and avoid some of these pitfalls?
So I not to be like the cobbler that's like no shoes here, but I think often the metrics that we set up for assessing the efficacy of data teams, the number of transforms we've written, or the number of dashboards that we have, or, end up being actually poison more than they end up being a true indicator of success. Usually it's I hate to say immeasurable things, but I do think that there's some very basics that are sort of well understood. When teams are growing, if there's demand for you to hire more data people, that's sort of the best indicator that your team is exceedingly valued. Sometimes the first or second data hire is a function of, our investors told us that we really need data, at this company. So, go do some data. But, if your team has the demand and the headcount to scale, that is like certainly the highest signal. Even if there are like specific numerical signals, like we've made this number of commits, or this number of lines of SQL written, or like, I think like those are certainly certainly metrics, but ultimately that's the highest signal. If you want to sort of take it down a step, which is to say, like, how do you know if your team is successful? Maybe there's sort of like hiring freeze going on across the board, so like that's not going to be a good enough like lagging indicator for you. How would you know if your team is successful? The answer is that your able to start spending less of the time on the at Ben Stancil type questions. So I by that I mean, typically there's sort of the requested in, and there's the sort of delivered out. And the requested in tends to have a hit rate that's, not always the greatest. And that's where we learn things like, no, to increase your total output, you have to say no to the bad requests. But really, the success metric for a team is like how much they can say no and keep the same sort of currency. So I think, not that you should keep sort of there shouldn't be like a table in a database, which is like requests that I was able to scorn or mock successfully. That's, there's a column and you like sum like, sum the stiff arms, divided by the total count of requests, weighted by the value of the questions that you've, I don't really, adhere to that type of metric, and none of the teams that I've ever worked on have ever measured themselves that way, I think. But I do think it's that ratio, that's the best sort of leading indicator beyond the explicit like hiring metric.
So I think I probably disagree with that, actually. On the hiring thing, I actually think the hiring thing can be kind of a dangerous signal. Like hiring is political power at startups to me. Like basically people come in, they want to grow a team. Like that, the way that people measure, rightly or wrongly, and mostly wrongly, but fine. The way that I think a lot of people measure like their level of influence at a company is the number of people that report to them. And you go around and ask people a startup and how big are you? How many people do you work there? Like that's kind of this rough measure of like hierarchies in Silicon Valley, at least. And I think that hiring in some ways can be polluted by that, where there's a lot of like, we worked at Microsoft for a period of time. Microsoft is sort of has a reputation, at least it did 10 years ago, for everything being very political. Yeah, there's like what seems like it's an XKCD comic, but I don't think actually is, about these orgs all like warring with each other. And very much a lot of that is like people wanting to have, I have more headcount than you. And so I think like hiring in some ways can be more of it's less true now probably in this current economic environment, but still like people aren't necessarily hiring because they need those people. They're hiring because that's the thing that gives them influence. On the request, though, I almost would just say, like, I think that honestly, the most successful teams are the ones that get a bunch of requests. Now, you could say that that's counterproductive, where what about self-serve? And we should be helping people answer their questions on their own. In practice, I think, though, like the better you do things like self-serve, the more people are going to ask questions anyway. Like that doesn't actually make it go away. And so essentially, like what I'm really getting at is what?
It's like the printer killing paper.
Yeah.
Sorry, computers killing the paper.
I mean, I would say less so. I just have computers kill paper. You mean newspapers or like physical paper?
Physical paper. This is like I'm offset 10 years from you, but anyway.
But my point is basically like I think that if people are asking questions and coming to you because they trust the things you're saying, that's the best measure of like, oh, these people care about me. They want me in the conversations. Like they matter. My opinions matter in this stuff. Whereas if they don't ask you, you could be like, it's because we have such good self-serve. But in reality, it's probably because people don't actually think that what you're giving them is that valuable.
I hate to change my mind, but that sounds like a pretty great answer. Yeah.
Okay, so we got another kind of question related to this, which is sort of exactly following on to that. What do you think about like data democratization? Like, should this be a thing? Should people basically go out and give sort of data marts and stuff to everybody else around the business where they can go do get their own answers and self-serve? Is that all like an important part of this story? Where does that put data teams? Like what's the role of people doing this on their own versus what data teams should be doing, especially at a smaller startup that's not, we're not Coca-Cola, we're a 100-person company or a 50-person company or whatever.
Yeah. So in my opinion, there is a real power law to the value of certain insights. So if I think back on my career, and it was a nice shout out to say that I was the one that figured out that business tools get used less on the weekends than on the weekday. I used all my brain to figure that one out. But there were, a few insights when we worked at Yammer, um, that I think were actually just the most impactful for us. One of them was we ran an A/B test, and that A/B test showed that one of the conditions beat the other condition, and that was counterintuitive to the CEO and the CTO's instinct, and then they got on board very quickly with the result. And I think like that was an insight that was worth thousands of the subsequent insights, which might have been much deeper than the mean of condition A is better than the mean of condition B. But so in the world where a couple insights can really be game changing for a company. Now, these aren't ones that you can like plan for in advance. So not ones that you set out to say, okay, let's go figure out the one insight that matters the most, because that sort of presupposes the end. I would say that data democracy. I want to take a little bit of a tough stance on this. Now, both of us, again, with the caveat, work at companies that work on tools that help teams democratize data. That said, I think that there's less value in it than whatever is sort of the standard view in the world. That is not to say that I'm very much opposed to democratizing data. Much of what we've worked on in our careers is getting data outside of sort of this like ivory castle and pushing it into the operations parts of the orgs that make real decisions that impact outcomes. So it's a cop-out answer, but I'm like, on the one hand, like I religiously and have spent my entire career trying to democratize data. On the other hand, I do think that data savvy folks that are navigating through challenge, through sort of optimization problems, and then share those in a way that's effective, are the types of insights that get people the 10x 100x results that they're looking for out of an analytics team.
Yeah, I think I probably agree with that mostly. I think that data democratization, self-serve, whatever, probably overvalued as it currently exists today. Kind of. I think it's very valuable as like an operational. Okay, we got to make decisions. A CSM has to make a decision about how do I talk to this customer? How have they been using the product? I now have it's not so much like an insight so much as it's just like I'm answering a question that will help me make this deck better. I need to put charts on this slide. This way I don't have to go bother the data team to do this kind of mechanical work. And I can do my job more effectively. I think that's actually very valuable. And I think there's a kind of a psychological value to data teams that if your job was just to be the help desk ticket filler, like a lot of people would not do the job. And so there is something where it's like, this is just sort of a shield to keep you from being mentioned on Yammer threads all the time. And occasionally think about problems that are like a little more fun and in theory more impactful. That said, I do think there's a possibility of like, so the problem there to me is actually a technology problem, not a problem with self-serve, where I think a lot of people are actually very capable of finding insights on their own that are not data people if they had a slightly more ergonomic way of doing it. And it's like that slightly more ergonomic way is not probably like another drag and drop tool that does things where you put this on the x-axis, this on the y-axis, and it's not a cube. It's something that's like, I think AI honestly has some potential here. Things where you actually have the ability to give people like answer questions in ways that they would otherwise. A lot of us have become really good like researchers, even though we don't understand a lot of subjects because we have Google and Wikipedia. And like that the ease of access that's given us, I think actually makes self-serve a lot different than what it was going to a library. Like I think prior to Google and Wikipedia, none of us are good researchers in anything. And you have to be like, oh, you have to have somebody who's like really knows how to think about this stuff. Now it's like, we can all kind of Google it and run through Wikipedia, and we can all kind of do a pretty good job of finding answers. I think if like something like that exists for data stuff, I think you can actually get pretty far. Okay, we got like 5 minutes left. I want to ask a couple quick questions, and if folks have any other questions, please put them in the chat. Quick question. So we talked about like what you would do if you were to join a team. What would you definitely not do on day one? Like what is something that a lot of folks do early that you would say, you know what, this is not the thing that I would start out with if I were starting to scale a data team?
Well, this is part of my personality, but I wouldn't put together like a plan. Like I wouldn't put together a 30, 60, 90, 180, 360 type plan. I would I would try to find an insight as deep as weekends are, less work happens. I would race to find an insight as deep as that. And I think like this is where people get this is how to start the virtuous. My whole like philosophy of data teams centers around virtuous cycles, and it's or startups. It's a cold start problem that you have. Even if you get hired with a bunch of excitement, you still have a cold start problem that you have to solve. And I would just race instantly towards it. So no planning architectures, no planning headcount, no planning um, what dashboards you're going to deliver and when. I think you're racing towards building a simple insight.
What's step two after finding out that people don't use your product on weekends as much as weekdays?
You find a second insight, which is like people don't use your product very much on 4th of July, which follows from the first insight. And then you find an actionable piece of that, which is like, okay, we don't have to call, we don't have to make somebody on call if the 4th of July traffic is, 50% of what we would expect it to be on this normal weekday. So I think you're racing to find, so that insight today would not get you very far. So if somebody, if you're working in a startup and you get hired into the first data role and you're here to, and then you come back at the end of day one and you're like, amazing news, this tool is not being used as much on the weekends, and I just figured that out on day one. Your boss or an executive would roll their eyes. It would instantly. Now, I would say like this is the type of thing you have to understand, that this is sort of on the path towards really building something, and you start to learn which parts of your data are messy, missing, confused. I always give the example, while we have a few minutes for a plug, I used to work at a hot sauce company, Bacon Hot Sauce, and the number one purchaser of Bacon Hot Sauce was a middle-aged woman in suburban New Jersey, my mother. And if you didn't know the data, and if you didn't do simple counts, and if you didn't rank the customers, and if you didn't do the most basic of these things, you could then start making insights like, we should run all of our Facebook and Google ads towards, suburban women in New Jersey. And that's really definitely not the right answer. I found that out later. And I think that's why I'm like, start with the insights, start with the conclusions, question those conclusions, and then go from there.
I remember a similar analysis at Yammer actually that said that we should be basically focusing entirely on selling to Milpitas. I have no idea what companies we had in Milpitas, but it's like a city in like the East Bay basically.
Northern
but it was like
San
we had
Jose.
like 3 customers in a city that had a total of 5 companies in it, and so it was like, oh my god, this is the best place to ever sell. And it was one of those things that like sort of made its way through the pipeline pretty far before somebody was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Okay, we got like 1 minute left. I want to ask one last quick question, which is, some folks have said in the chat, like their bosses are basically saying we need to only do things that offer real value, focus on revenue growth, cost savings, things like that. Obviously, what you're suggesting is things that don't necessarily tie immediately to value in that way. What advice would you give this person that's getting sort of told to work on the stuff that sort of has an obvious tie back to the sort of bottom line?
I wholeheartedly agree with that statement. So of their boss. So I just said, hey, like I did all this analysis about weekends and users and stuff like that. Ultimately, you need to know the revenue equation of the business, and I'm sure that that's covered all over the internet. But working on problems that very, very, very closely tie to revenue, you're much, 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 much more likely to make a big impact with a minor insight. So Yammer was a unique company where all of its revenue was highly predictable based on its usage. And when you have companies that look like that, then you can start to make more subtle insights about kind of how you drive more usage, and and the links, essentially all work. But I always start from a place of the way that understand how does the company make money, what are the inputs towards how the company makes money, and what are the ways in which the company might make more or less, or save on costs, and what are the things that drive the costs, and sort of doing analyses around those things, which are big variables in the revenue or cost equations, I think are often the most fruitful places to start analysis.
Awesome. So we are at time. Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Fish, for joining as well. Yeah, thanks everybody, and I'll talk to y'all soon.